Let me tell you a story about a man with nothing left to lose, a woman with a secret that could get her killed, and a single silver dollar that stood between a good life and a quick death. His name was Wade Carter, and as he stood on the worn wooden steps of the Dry Gulch Chapel, the only thing he owned in the world was the Morgan silver dollar pressed between his calloused fingers. That coin had survived what nothing else had. Not his ranch, not the brother he'd buried, not the life he'd spent a decade building before the fire came and burned it all to ash and memory. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of beeswax and old prayers. Father Miguel stood waiting, a heavy registry book spread open on the lectern. The old priest's eyes were full of questions Wade had no intention of answering. A man didn't walk into God's house to buy a bride with his last dollar and then explain himself. You just signed where the finger pointed and prayed you hadn't made the biggest mistake of your life. She's waiting, Father Miguel said, his voice as soft as the morning mist. Been here since before dawn? Wade just nodded. His boots echoed on the pine boards, a lonely sound in the empty chapel. And there, in the front pew, she sat. Her back was as straight as a rifle barrel. Eliza Hart. Her white dress had seen better days, gone silver with age and countless washings, but she'd pressed it with care. Her brown hair was pulled back tight, showing off a face that hadn't broken yet, no matter what kind of hell had driven her to this place. She didn't even look up when his shadow fell over her. He sat down on the pew, the old wood groaning under his weight. He placed the Morgan dollar on the bench between them, a silver island in a sea of desperation. Her eyes flickered to the coin, then away, quick as a spooked doe. You don't owe me nothing but the truth, Wade said, the words coming out rougher than he'd meant. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, I got a right to know that much. Eliza's hand moved slow, like she was reaching through deep water. Her fingers didn't take the coin. Instead, they closed over his hand, pressing the dollar back into his palm. You already paid, she whispered. It was a strange thing, the warmth of her hand. Wade had forgotten that warmth could exist in anything smaller than a campfire. Behind them, Father Miguel cleared his throat. Shall we begin? The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. There were no flowers, no guests, no witnesses save for God, and the dust motes dancing in the pale window light. Wade didn't have a ring to give her, and Eliza didn't seem to expect one. They spoke their vows like two people signing a deed to a piece of land they'd never seen. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, they just stood there, two strangers tied together by nothing more than words and necessity. Outside, Wade's wagon waited, loaded with the few things he'd managed to drag from the fire: a coffee pot, a bedroll, a box of tools. Everything a man needed to start over from nothing, and nothing a woman would ever want for making a home. Eliza climbed up without a word, arranging her skirts over boots that had seen better decades. They rode out of Dry Gulch in silence, the creak of the wagon wheels the only sound between them. Wade kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, but he could feel her beside him, solid and real, and suddenly his responsibility. When the sun was high and hot, he pulled the wagon into the skinny shade of a red rock shelf. He passed her the canteen and a piece of hardtack from his bag. She ate in a way he'd never seen before. Delicate, breaking off tiny pieces like she was trying to make it last a week. When he offered her the rest, she just pushed it back toward him. I'm not hungry, she said, but then her hand went to her stomach, a quick, protective gesture, smoothing the worn fabric of her dress. Wade had seen that gesture before, on his brother's wife, before the fever took her, on the women at church socials, their faces glowing with a secret they were just starting to share. His jaw went tight, but he kept his voice as level as the horizon. How far along? Eliza went perfectly still, like a deer that's just heard the snap of a twig. For a second, he thought she might bolt, but then her shoulder slumped and Wade saw the first real crack in her armor. 4 months, she whispered. Maybe 5. The words hung in the dry air between them, a challenge and a confession all at once. Any other man would have turned that wagon around right then and there. Any other man would have stormed back to the priest and demanded his dollar back, claimed fraud, had the whole thing annulled. Most men would have, but Wade Carter wasn't most men. He thought about the fire, about standing in the smoking ruins of his life with his brother's body not even cold in the ground. He thought about the choice he'd made that day. Either put his pistol in his mouth or use that last silver dollar to buy something that might make tomorrow different from yesterday. He had chosen tomorrow. "You should have told me," he said. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw the fire in them. "Would you have come?" The honest answer was, he didn't know, but he was here now, with a wife he didn't know, carrying a child that wasn't his, and nowhere to go but forward into the scorched and empty wilderness that was his life. They were two broken people, bound by a $1 bargain, riding toward a future that was as black and uncertain as a starless night, and somewhere behind them, the secret she was running from was getting ready to follow. That night they made camp under a sandstone ledge, carved out by ancient waters. Wade built the fire small, Cherokee-style, more hot coals than leaping flames, so it wouldn't be seen from a distance. Eliza helped without being asked, her movements quiet and efficient in the fading light. After a dinner of bitter trail coffee and the last of the hardtack, they sat watching the stars punch holes in the darkening sky. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with the things they hadn't said. "His name was Calvin Rook," Eliza said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if they'd been under pressure. "He's the son of Judge Bartholomew Rook, over in Red Mesa." Wade poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night. Red Mesa. That was bad. Judge Rook ran that town and half the county like it was his own personal kingdom. He was the law, the bank, and the gallows all rolled into one. "He made promises he never meant to keep," Eliza continued, her hand finding its way back to her belly. "When I told him about this, he told me to find someone to make it go away. Said he knew people who could arrange things." "So you ran," Wade thought. "So you answered my advertisement." She turned to look at him then, her face lit by the flickering firelight. A man wanting a wife, no questions asked. It seemed like we both needed something the other could give. I needed a name that wasn't poison in these parts. I needed a man who keeps his word, even when the bargain turns sour. "I needed a reason not to follow my brother into the ground," Wade said, the honesty of it surprising even himself. He looked at her, this stranger who was now his wife. "So you needed protection from this Rook fellow." "What I need," she said, and her voice was suddenly hard as steel, "is a chance to raise this child without shame and without fear." Wade studied her then. She was a fierce little thing for all her delicate ways. She reminded him of a barn cat he'd once seen, a skinny thing that had faced down a full-grown coyote to protect her kittens. She was small and desperate, and absolutely unwilling to break. "I keep my word," he said finally. The words felt like a vow, more real than the ones he'd spoken in the chapel. "But I need yours too. No more lies between us. No more secrets that matter. We're married strangers, but that's got to count for something." Eliza nodded slowly in the firelight. No more lies. But as Wade laid out his bedroll on the other side of the fire, the rifle close by his hand, he knew it wasn't that simple. She'd told him a name, Calvin Rook, but she hadn't told him everything. He could feel it. There was another secret coiled up inside her, something darker and more dangerous than a broken promise from a rich man's son. And he had a gut feeling that this other secret was the real reason she was running for her life. They reached his land by late afternoon the next day. Wade watched Eliza's face as they crested the final ridge, and she got her first look at what he'd brought her to. He called it Raven's Draw. It was less a home and more a scar on the land. The cabin was a blackened husk, huddled against a grove of cottonwood trees like it was trying to hide its shame. Black streaks ran up the walls where the fire had licked them clean. The roof gaped open to the sky in a dozen places. The barn was worse, nothing but a skeleton of charred beams pointing at the sky like accusing fingers. It was a picture of absolute devastation, a place where hope had come to die. But Eliza didn't flinch. She just climbed down from the wagon, walked right up to the ruined cabin, and laid her hand on the soot-stained doorframe. "It's got good bones," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We can work with this." Wade felt something in his chest unclench, a knot of tension he hadn't even realized was there. He'd expected tears or anger or despair. He had not expected resolve. Nothing worth doing is ever easy, and he said. They spent the rest of the daylight taking stock. The big stone fireplace in the main room had survived. One of the two bedrooms was mostly intact, if you didn't mind sleeping under the stars. And the old hand pump in the kitchen still drew water from the well, rusty at first, but it ran clean and cold. That night, they ate the last of their trail food sitting on the floor of the main room, their backs against the wall, the silence between them filled with the crackle of a small fire in the hearth. I know what you gave up, Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. Using your last dollar on me. Wade reached into his pocket and pulled out the Morgan dollar. He turned it over and over, the worn silver eagle catching the firelight. Still got it, he said. Figured we might need it for something more important down the line. Like what? She asked. He thought for a moment, looking at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw and the exhaustion in her eyes. Maybe something for the baby, when it comes. He heard her breath catch in her throat. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion he couldn't name. It's not your blood. Blood is what you're born with, Wade said, looking into the fire. Family is what you choose to build. I made my choice when I signed that book. She started crying then. Not loud, sobbing cries, but silent tears that traced paths through the dust on her cheeks and caught the firelight like tiny diamonds. Wade didn't move to comfort her. He knew some griefs had to be felt all the way through, without interruption. Later, after she had retreated to the one livable bedroom, Wade sat by the dying fire, keeping watch. It was an old soldier's habit, but tonight it felt different. He wasn't just guarding a piece of land. He was guarding a life. 2 lives. And as he sat there in the dark, the Morgan dollar warm in his hand, he knew that the Rooks would not just let this go. Men like Judge Rook didn't suffer insults, and they didn't let go of what they considered their property. Trouble was coming, sure as the sunrise. But as Wade listened to the quiet sound of Eliza's breathing from the other room, a strange thought came to him. He'd come to Ravensdraw to die one way or another. But for the first time since the fire, as he looked around the ruins of his past, all he could think about was building a future. The work started at dawn. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. Wade tore down the burnt timbers, his muscles screaming in protest, while Eliza swept out piles of ash and debris, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She was stronger than she looked, and she worked with a quiet, relentless determination that matched his own. By noon, they had cleared enough of the main room to see the true extent of the damage. The bones of the place were still sound. His brother Jonah had built it to last. Wade ran his hand along a massive support beam, the wood rough and familiar under his palm. He remembered the day he and Jonah had raised it, 2 young men full of sweat and whiskey, and the belief that they had all the time in the world. Tell me about him, Eliza said, her voice soft. She'd followed his gaze. Your brother. Jonah was the dreamer, Wade said, pulling a charred board free and tossing it onto the growing pile outside. I was the doer. He'd draw up plans for a house as grand as anything in Denver, and I'd figure out how to build it with what we had. What happened? She asked. Wade's voice went flat, all the life draining out of it. Lightning hit the barn during a dry storm. The wind was fierce. It took the fire to the house before we could do anything. Jonah, he went back in for the horses. Wade stopped, his throat closing up. A beam came down on him. He felt her hand on his arm, a brief, warm touch. I'm sorry. Sorry, don't bring him back, Wade said, shrugging off her touch. Not unkindly, but he wasn't ready for comfort. Not yet. Best thing we can do for him is rebuild what he started. They worked until the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. That evening, Eliza somehow managed to make a meal out of almost nothing. She'd found some wild onions growing by the creek, and Wade had snared a rabbit. They ate at the scarred kitchen table, which she'd covered with a clean flour sack. It almost looked civilized. You cook like someone who's had to make do before, Wade observed. A shadow passed over her face. My father was a traveling preacher. We lived on whatever the congregation could spare. He died 2 winters back. Lung fever. Is that when you met Calvin Rook? She nodded, her fork pushing the food around her plate. He came to the funeral. Said such beautiful things about my father's sermons. He said he needed someone with real faith to help him become a better man. She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. And I was fool enough to believe him. Wade knew the type. Men like Calvin Rook were born with money and power, and they believed the world owed them everything. They collected women like trophies and discarded them when they became inconvenient. His father, the judge, he runs that whole territory like his own personal kingdom, Eliza said, her eyes meeting his across the table. Calvin's being groomed to take his place. That's why I couldn't stay. A judge's grandson can't have the wrong kind of bloodline, and my blood wasn't pure enough anymore. Not once it carried shame. The word hung in the air between them. Shame. It was a powerful weapon in the hands of men like the Rooks. That night, Wade laid out his bedroll by the fireplace again, his rifle within easy reach. The first week passed in a rhythm of hammers and saws, of shared labor and quiet meals. They were like two planets orbiting the same sun of survival, close but never touching. Eliza never once complained about the crude conditions. She just worked alongside him, and slowly, miraculously, the burnt-out shell began to feel less like a tomb and more like a shelter. She sewed curtains from an old petticoat. She found a patch of good soil and planted the few seeds she'd brought with her. She even found a bucket of old whitewash and covered the worst of the fire stains on the inside walls. Each small victory felt like an act of defiance. Then one night, Wade woke to the sound of hoofbeats. He was on his feet in an instant, the Winchester in his hands before he was even fully awake. Peering through a crack in the boarded-up window, he saw a lone rider circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. The horse's shoes rang against the stones in the yard, unnaturally loud in the dead-still air. Wade eased the front door open just a crack, staying deep in the shadows. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice low and hard. The rider pulled his horse up short. "Easy there, friend. Just delivering a message." "Some messages don't keep till morning." The man leaned forward in his saddle, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. "You'd be Wade Carter." "And I'd be the man holding a Winchester on you. State your business." The rider pulled something from his coat and tossed it onto the porch. It landed with a soft thud. "I'm just the messenger," he said. "What you do with the message ain't my concern." He wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, the sound of its hoofbeats quickly fading into the darkness. Wade waited a full minute before stepping out onto the porch. He knelt down and picked up what the rider had left. It was an envelope made of heavy, expensive paper, sealed with a blob of red wax. Inside the cabin, a lamp was lit. Eliza stood in the doorway to the bedroom, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her face pale in the flickering light. "What was it?" she whispered. Wade broke the wax seal with his thumb and angled the paper to catch the lamplight. The message was short, the handwriting elegant and cruel. "She was promised to me. You have no claim." There was no signature, but they both knew who had sent it. Wade slowly crumpled the paper in his fist and tossed it into the glowing coals of the fireplace. He watched it curl and blacken, the words turning to ash. "That's the first move," he said, his voice grim. "It won't be the last." Sleep didn't come easy after that. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sounded like a threat. Wade found himself walking the perimeter of the property at night, learning the lay of the land, planning fields of fire, thinking like a soldier again. He was preparing for a war he hoped wouldn't come, but knew in his bones probably would. A few days later, they hitched up the wagon and made the half-day ride to Perdition, the nearest town with a general store. Wade kept the rifle across his knees the whole way, his eyes scanning the hillsides. He kept Eliza close on the wagon seat beside him. Let people look. Let them see. Eliza Hart was Eliza Carter now. She was under his protection. At Morrison's general store, he made a point of introducing her properly. "My wife," he said to Old Man Morrison, his voice leaving no room for questions. "She needs some things for the house." Morrison's eyes, magnified behind his spectacles, went wide. They darted from Wade to Eliza's still flat belly and back again. "Heard tell you gotten hitched, Wade. Didn't credit it, though." "Well, you can credit it now." While Eliza looked at bolts of fabric and sacks of flour, Wade stocked up on ammunition. He bought boxes of cartridges for the Winchester and his Colt, along with powder and primers. Morrison watched him pile the supplies on the counter, his face a mask of worried curiosity. "You still got credit here, son," Morrison said quietly, pulling out a dusty ledger. "On account of your brother. God rest his soul." "Appreciate that, Silas," Wade said, adding a few more items to the pile. "Tell me, you had any strangers come through lately?" Morrison paused his figuring. "Now that you mention it, yeah, a couple of fellas, asking a lot of questions about who owned which homesteads, who lived where." His eyes were knowing. "I told them I make it a habit to mind my own business." "You're a smart man." Outside, as they were loading the supplies into the wagon, Wade noticed something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There were fresh boot prints in the dust around their wagon. Not just a few, but a lot. Someone had been circling it while they were inside, checking it out. He looked underneath in the wagon bed, but found nothing out of place. Still, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, prickled his skin all the way home. That night, the second message arrived. This time, there was no writer. Wade found it nailed to the front door when he went out for a final check of the property before turning in. It was the same heavy paper, the same red wax seal. The message was even shorter and much crueler. "A bastard has no father. Send her back." He burned this one too, but not before Eliza saw it. Her face went hard as winter ground. "Let me guess what comes next," she said, her voice devoid of fear, filled only with a cold, hard certainty. "First the threats, then the bribes, then the violence." "You've thought this through," Wade said, studying her in the dim lamplight. "I've had months to think of nothing else." Her hand went to her belly, a gesture that was becoming as natural to her as breathing. It was the first time Wade noticed the slightest hint of a swell there. "Calvin doesn't want me, Wade, and he sure as hell doesn't want this child. He wants control. His father is a powerful man with political ambitions. He can't have a grandchild born on the wrong side of the blanket. It's a stain, so they'll try to erase the stain, one way or another." She was right. He knew she was right. Men like the Rooks didn't leave loose ends. "Then we'd best prepare for a siege," Wade said. He spent the next few days turning the cabin into a fortress. He boarded up the windows, leaving small slits to shoot through. He cleared a field of fire around the cabin, cutting down brush and small trees. He filled every barrel he could find with water from the well, in case they tried to burn them out. Eliza worked beside him, her face grim and determined. She asked no questions. She just moved her few belongings to the safest corners of the cabin, the places that offered the most cover. The boot prints around the property multiplied. They never saw who was making them, but Wade knew they were being scouted, their defenses noted, their routines cataloged. The enemy was gathering intelligence before the strike. He started sleeping even lighter, the rifle no longer just near his hand, but in it. He started watching Eliza closer too. He noticed how the pregnancy was beginning to change her. The new roundness to her belly, the way she would sometimes pause in her work, her hand pressed to her side, her breathing careful and shallow. "When's the baby due?" he asked her one evening, the question surprising them both. She looked at him, a strange expression on her face. "Best I can figure, late December, maybe early January." "We need to know what we're working with," he said, trying to sound practical, timeline-wise. But that wasn't the whole truth, and he knew she could see it in his eyes. Somewhere in the last few weeks of sweat and fear and shared labor, that baby had stopped being just her burden. It had become real to him. It was a life they were protecting together, a future. The attack came 3 nights later, hidden by a driving rainstorm. The first drops hissed on the hot stones of the chimney, and soon the patched roof began to leak, water running down the inside walls like tears. Wade and Eliza moved what they could to dry spots, both of them soaked to the skin within minutes. Then a brilliant flash of lightning lit up the yard, bright as noon. And in that split second of white light, Wade saw them. 3 riders sitting on their horses at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin. They were as still and silent as ghosts. When the thunder rolled away and the darkness crashed back in, they were gone. "They're out there," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. "I know." They sat up together that night, their backs against the wall, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof like a countdown. Wade's rifle was laid across his knees. Eliza held a long, sharp kitchen knife, testing its edge with her thumb. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, they were quiet, waiting, ready. "I won't let them take you," Wade said into the darkness. "I know," Eliza replied, her voice soft but sure. And then, even softer, "That's why I chose you." They came just before dawn, four shadows moving through the last of the rain. Wade heard them before he saw them, the creak of wet leather, the soft snort of a horse, the squelch of boots in the thick mud. He touched Eliza's shoulder, and she was awake in an instant, the kitchen knife already in her hand. "Stay inside," he whispered, his voice urgent. "No matter what you hear, promise me." Her fingers found his in the darkness and squeezed once, hard. "I promise." Wade slipped out the back door, moving through the shadows like a ghost. The Winchester felt like a part of his arm, as familiar as his own breathing. He learned in the war that darkness could be your armor, if you knew how to wear it. He watched as three of the men approached the front of the cabin, while the fourth split off, heading for the barn. A classic pincer move. Amateurs. He let them spread out, divide their attention. Then, patient as a wolf, he waited until the man at the barn was isolated. He moved fast and silent. The butt of his rifle connected with the base of the man's skull. The man went down without a sound, a sack of wet clothes in the mud. Wade dragged him behind the water trough. One down. "Carter!" The voice that cut through the rain was rough and mean, thick with cheap whiskey. "We just came to talk business." Wade stayed silent, letting them wonder where he was. He'd found a good position near the corral, hidden in the deep shadows of the fence. He could see them clearly now. Three men spread out in a half circle, facing the cabin door. "Your woman's got something that don't belong to her," the man shouted again. "Mr. Rook wants it back." Just then a fourth figure stepped out from behind the horses. He was dressed in a fine city coat, his hair slicked back, looking completely out of place in the mud and rain. He moved with the easy arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Calvin Rook. "Really, Carter," Calvin called out, his voice cultured and cold. "This melodrama is entirely unnecessary." "The lady made her choice," Wade called back, letting his voice bounce off the barn so they couldn't pinpoint his location. "Signed and legal." Calvin laughed, an ugly, grating sound. "Legal? My father is the law in 3 counties. Your sham marriage isn't worth the paper it's written on." "Maybe not in Red Mesa," Wade said, "but this is perdition territory. Different jurisdiction." "Jurisdiction?" Calvin spat the word like it was poison. "You think a line on a map matters? I came to retrieve my property. The woman is carrying my property." That's when Wade saw it. The man he dropped by the trough was starting to stir, his hand reaching for the pistol tucked in his belt. There was no more time for talk. Wade's first shot wasn't at a man. It was at the lantern one of them was holding. The bullet shattered the glass, kerosene splashed, and the wick ignited it. The man screamed, dancing and slapping at the flames that licked up his sleeve. Wade's second shot punched a hole in the water barrel another man was using for cover, sending him diving into the mud with a yelp. "The barn!" someone shouted, and Wade realized his mistake. The fourth man, the one he'd knocked out, was back on his feet. He had a torch, and he was already at the barn door. In seconds, the whole place would go up, and the horses would be trapped. Wade broke cover, swinging the rifle toward the man with the torch. But Calvin was faster than he looked. His fancy coat cleared his holster smooth as silk, and his pistol barked. Bullets sparked off the stones right where Wade had been standing, driving him back behind the fence. And then the cabin door exploded open. Eliza stood there, framed in the lamplight from inside. She was holding his brother Jonah's old double-barreled shotgun, the stock braced firmly against her shoulder. She looked like some avenging angel out of the Old Testament, her nightdress billowing in the wind, her hair wild around her face, her belly round with his child, and her eyes filled with a righteous fury that could stop a man's heart. "Drop the torch," she commanded, and her voice rang out clear as a church bell, cutting through the rain and the shouting. The man with the torch just laughed. "You won't shoot, Missy. Not in your condition." Eliza's answer was to pull both triggers. The roar of the shotgun was deafening. It didn't hit the man. It hit the torch, blowing it out of his hand in a shower of sparks and splinters. He screamed, clutching the mangled ruin of his fingers. The torch fell into a puddle and sputtered out. In the chaos that followed, Wade moved. He came up behind the whiskey-voiced spokesman, the barrel of the Winchester finding the soft spot right below his ear. "Tell your boys to stand down," Wade growled. But Calvin wasn't listening. His pistol was swinging toward Eliza, and Wade saw the raw, naked murder in his eyes. He wasn't aiming for her. He was aiming for her belly, for the inconvenient proof of his sin. Wade didn't even think. He just fired. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, and the bullet caught Calvin high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered backward, a look of pure shock on his face, and his pistol fell from his nerveless fingers into the mud. "The next one goes center mass," Wade said, his voice as calm and conversational as if he were ordering a drink. "Anyone else want to discuss property rights?" No one did. The burnt man was still moaning. The one who'd been behind the water barrel hadn't moved. The spokesman stood frozen with Wade's rifle at his neck. Only Calvin was still trying to fight, struggling to his knees in the mud, his good hand pressed to the spreading red stain on his fine coat. "You shot me," he said, his voice full of disbelief. "Don't you know who I am?" "Yeah," Wade said. "I do." Then Eliza descended the porch steps, barefoot in the mud, the shotgun still held at the ready. She walked right up to the kneeling, wounded Calvin Rook. "You said I carry your property," she said, her voice like ice. "You're wrong. This child is mine. Mine to birth, mine to raise, and mine to protect. You gave up any claim to him the day you told me to get rid of him." She looked him right in the eye. "And if you, or your father, or any more of your hired trash ever come near my family again, I will kill you myself. That's not a threat. It is a promise before God." Then she turned her back on him, the ultimate insult, and walked back into the cabin, bolting the door behind her. It was over, for now. Wade watched as the hired men scrambled to get the wounded Calvin onto a horse. "This isn't over," Calvin gritted out through his teeth. "My father will hear of this." "Tell him to come himself if he's got something to say," Wade said. He watched them ride off into the darkness, a sorry, defeated bunch. Then he made a slow circle of the yard, checking for any last surprises. When he went back inside, he found Eliza sitting by the fire, her hands trembling, her face as pale as ash. "You promised to stay inside," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I promised not to come out no matter what I heard. I didn't hear you dying, so I came out." He didn't know what to say to that. He set his rifle by the door, the adrenaline suddenly draining away, leaving him bone-weary. He looked at her, this woman who had just faced down armed men to protect him, to protect their unborn child. "That's what marriage is, isn't it?" she whispered as if reading his mind. "Facing what comes together." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, her head fitting perfectly under his chin. They stood there for a long time, holding on to each other, while the fire crackled and the last of the rain whispered against the roof. They had won the battle. But Wade knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the war had just begun. And Judge Bartholomew Rook was not a man who ever countenanced defeat. "We have to run," Wade said the next morning, standing amidst the churned mud and debris of the fight. Eliza's chin came up, a stubborn fire in her eyes. "I'm tired of running." "Better tired than dead," Wade said grimly. "They came with 4 men this time. Next time it will be 10 or 20. They'll come back with the law on their side, with a warrant signed by Judge Rook himself. We bought ourselves some time, but that's all." She knew he was right. Her hand rested on her belly, a silent acknowledgement of the life that depended on their choices. "Then where would we go?" "North," Wade said. "Colorado, maybe Wyoming. Somewhere the Rook name doesn't mean anything. Somewhere we can start fresh." He hated the words even as he said them. He was asking her to abandon this place, this small piece of ground they had just started to call home. He was asking himself to leave his brother's grave behind. But he looked at Eliza, at the fierce, protective love in her eyes, and he knew it was the only choice. "Sometime," he said, his voice rough, "the only choice you have is to choose which loss you can live with." They loaded the wagon that afternoon, a somber, methodical task. The good tools, the few household goods, the dwindling provisions. As the sun set, painting the mountains in hues of blood and fire, they took one last look at Raven's Draw. "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly, her hand finding his on the wagon seat, "that you have to leave him." Wade clicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. He didn't look back. "He's not in that grave," he said. "He's in what I learned from him. He's in what I carry forward." He squeezed her hand. "And that includes taking care of what matters most." They rolled into the darkness, fugitives with no destination, leaving behind a spiral of smoke from the morning's violence. It wasn't over. Wade knew that Calvin Rook's pride and his father's power would not allow it. But for now they were together, they were alive, and they were moving toward tomorrow. And some days that was victory enough. 3 days later, the fever took hold of Eliza. The cold nights and constant stress had worn her down. She slumped against him on the wagon seat, her skin burning hot to the touch. Wade pushed the horses harder, a cold knot of fear tightening in his gut. He was following a rumor, a whisper he'd heard from a traveling preacher about a woman named May Caldwell. A midwife who lived in the wilderness, a healer who asked few questions. He found her place at dusk, a sturdy cabin tucked against a graystone butte. Before he could even call out, the door opened, and a woman stood silhouetted in the lamplight. She was tall and broad-shouldered, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. "Bring her in," May Caldwell said, her voice calm and steady, as if she'd been expecting them all along. "Quickly now." Wade carried Eliza inside. The cabin smelled of lavender and clean linen. May examined Eliza with hands that were both gentle and sure. "How far along?" she asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. 6 months, maybe more," Wade answered. May nodded, mixing a concoction of herbs in a cup. "The baby's heartbeat is strong. It's the mama who's in trouble. Exhaustion, exposure. Looks like she hasn't been eating enough for two." She helped Eliza sip the mixture. Then she turned her piercing gaze on Wade. "You running from something or toward something?" "Both," Wade said. "Usually is." May studied him for a long moment. "You the father?" "I'm her husband." "That's not what I asked." Wade met her gaze without flinching. "I'm the one who will raise this child. That makes me the father." Something in May's weathered face softened. "Good answer," she said. "Now get out while I work. There's firewood that needs splitting out back. Make yourself useful." Wade spent the next few hours splitting logs. The simple, honest labor, a balm for his frayed nerves. It was full dark when May finally came out. "She's sleeping," she said, handing him a cup of coffee, thick as mud. "But she needs rest. Real rest. A few weeks at least." "We can't stay," Wade started. "There are people looking for us." "Can't is a word for people who have choices," May said bluntly. "You show up on my doorstep with a pregnant woman half dead from running. You think I don't know trouble when I see it? The only question is whether you're the kind of trouble worth harboring." So Wade told her, not everything, but enough. About Calvin Rook, the threats, the attack. May listened without a word, her face as unreadable as stone. "Rooks," she said finally, the name tasting like something bitter in her mouth. "I delivered Calvin myself 26 years ago. Even as a baby, he grabbed at everything and screamed when he couldn't have it." She looked Wade up and down. "I have a proposition for you. You stay here, help me through the winter. I'm getting too old to haul wood and water like I used to. In return, I'll help your wife deliver this baby safe and sound, and I'll teach her what she needs to know to keep it alive out here." "Why would you risk it?" Wade asked, stunned. "Why would you help us?" A wry, sad smile touched her lips. "Because I've buried 3 husbands and 2 sons. Because I know what it feels like to need shelter when the world has turned against you." Her smile sharpened. "And because I purely, deeply hate bullies who think their money makes them God." They stayed. The cabin became their sanctuary, a tiny island of peace in a sea of uncertainty. May ran her household like a military outpost. Everyone had duties. Wade hauled water, tended the animals, and repaired the aging cabin. Eliza, once her strength returned, became May's apprentice. She learned about herbs and tinctures, how to read the signs of a laboring woman, how to turn a breech baby with gentle, careful hands. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire. Eliza devoured the books May kept on a small shelf, medical texts, worn novels, even poetry. "You read like you're starving," May observed one night. "I am," Eliza admitted. Calvin, he had opinions about women and books. He said too much learning made a woman dissatisfied with her natural state. "Natural state," May snorted. "Like that boy would know. Natural from a nail in his boot. You keep reading, girl. Knowledge is the only thing they can't ever take away from you." Wade watched them, these two strong, stubborn women, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since before the fire. He watched Eliza's belly grow, and the baby inside became more real to him every day. It was no longer her secret or his burden. It was their future, growing in the safety of these four walls. Then one night, a rider came, a young mail carrier named Silas Fletcher, his horse having thrown a shoe. As Wade helped him with the horse, and May gave him coffee and cornbread, Silas started talking. "There's been some excitement over in Red Mesa," he said, his eyes darting between them. "The judge's son, Calvin Rook, he got himself shot. Folks are pretty stirred up about it. He's claiming it was some fella named Carter, says he stole his fiancée." Silas looked directly at Wade then. "Judge has put out a reward, $100 for any information on where they went." After Silas left, a new tension settled over the cabin. $100 was a lot of money, enough to make a man forget his conscience. The pressure began to build. It was subtle at first. Twice when Wade was riding the perimeter of May's property, he found tracks. Someone had been camped out in the woods watching the house. Then a letter arrived from a lawyer in Denver, a nephew of May's. He wrote that there had been inquiries about the ownership of her land, about whether she had a clear title. "It's Rook," May said, her face grim as she fed the letter to the fire. "He's testing our defenses, looking for a weak spot." The legal attack came a week later. Another letter, this one with an official court seal. Calvin Rook had filed a formal petition in his father's court. He claimed a prior contract of marriage with Eliza Hart. He was demanding the return of his promised bride and, as the legal language so coldly put it, any issue thereof. "Property," Eliza whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. "He's still calling his own child property." "A court in Red Mesa, with his father as the judge," Wade said, the rage building in his chest. "It's a rigged game." "Then we need to find a way to play on a different board," May said. "You need a lawyer, and I know just the one." The lawyer May sent him to wasn't a man. Her name was Nora Bell. She was a widow who kept a small, cramped office above the land registry in Perdition. Officially, she was just a legal clerk, but as she put it, "I read law, passed the territorial exam, but no judge in this territory will recognize a woman advocate. So I ghostwrite. I prepare the documents, I advise on procedure, and a man with a license puts his name on it." Nora Bell listened to Wade's entire story without interruption, her pen flying across the page in a precise shorthand. "I knew Eliza Hart," she said when he was finished, her voice tight. "She taught my daughter piano for a short time, a sweet, decent woman. What the Rooks did to her, it's not right." Her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "We can't win in Judge Rook's court, but we can challenge the jurisdiction. Your marriage took place in Dry Gulch. You reside in Perdition territory. We can file a response here, in Judge Whittam's court. He's a fair man. He can't be bought." "Will it be enough?" Wade asked. "Honestly, no. Bartholomew Rook will find a way to interfere. But it buys us time. It makes them fight on our ground. And it makes our position official." She looked Wade squarely in the eye. "But there's more. I've been doing some digging into the Rooks for a long time. My husband, he suspected something wasn't right with the way Judge Rook acquired his land holdings years ago." She pulled out an old brittle map from a locked drawer. "Your ranch, Raven's Draw, it sits on a key parcel of land. According to the original territorial survey, your family's deed predates the one Judge Rook holds. My husband believed Rook's deed was a forgery. He was gathering evidence when he fell ill. Wade stared at the map, his mind reeling. My brother, Jonah, he was always going through our father's old papers, looking for something. What if he found it? Nora said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. What if he found the original deed? Proof that the Rook's entire empire is built on a lie. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. The fire. It wasn't just lightning. Jonah hadn't just gone back for the horses. They didn't just want to silence him about Eliza, Wade said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. They wanted to destroy the proof. They murdered my brother and burned my home to cover up a decades-old crime. The fight was no longer just about protecting Eliza and the baby. It was about justice. It was about vengeance. They gathered their evidence. Affidavits from Father Miguel, from Morrison the storekeeper. A damning medical statement from May Caldwell about Eliza's condition and the timing of the pregnancy. And Nora Bell drafted a masterful response, not only defending the marriage, but formally challenging the legitimacy of Judge Rook's land title, citing the lost Carter deed. They had thrown a torch into the Rook's powder keg. Now all they could do was wait for the explosion. The courtroom in Perdition was plain and honest, nothing like the brick monument to power Judge Rook had built in Red Mesa. Judge Ira Whittam was a man carved from the hard-bitten territory he served, his eyes missing nothing. Across the aisle, Calvin Rook sat with his expensive Denver lawyer, looking pale and nervous. In the front row of the gallery, like a king holding court, sat Judge Bartholomew Rook, his face a mask of cold fury. The battle was fierce. The lawyer, Wellbridge, painted Eliza as a scheming opportunist and Wade as a violent kidnapper. He presented letters Eliza had written during her courtship with Calvin, twisting her words to make her sound desperate and manipulative. But then it was Wade's turn. He called May Caldwell, who testified with the unshakable authority of a medical professional. He called Silas Fletcher, who reluctantly testified about Calvin's reputation. Then he called Eliza. She walked to the witness stand, her hand resting on her 7-month belly, and she told her truth. Her voice, soft at first, grew stronger with every word. She spoke of Calvin's promises and his betrayal, of her fear and her flight. Wellbridge tried to tear her down on cross-examination, his questions dripping with insinuation and contempt. Isn't it true, Mrs. Carter, he sneered, that when you found yourself in an unfortunate condition, you tried to force my client's hand, and when he counseled patience, you fled to the bed of another man? Before Wade could object, Eliza answered, her voice ringing with a quiet dignity that silenced the room. No, sir, that is not true. When I found myself with child, I asked the father to honor his promises. He responded by suggesting I find someone to remove the problem. When I refused, he abandoned me. I did not flee to another man's bed. I fled to a man who offered me his name and his protection when the father of my child offered me nothing but shame and violence. The tide had turned. You could feel it in the room. But the final blow came when Wade, in his closing argument, presented Nora Bell's research. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady, this case is not about a broken promise of marriage. It is about a pattern of abuse and corruption that has terrorized this territory for 20 years. It is about the man sitting in that gallery, Judge Bartholomew Rook. The room erupted. Judge Rook was on his feet shouting. Wellbridge was objecting, but Judge Whittam's gavel cracked like a rifle shot, demanding order. We have reason to believe, Wade continued, his voice rising above the din, that Judge Rook's entire claim to his lands is fraudulent, and that the fire at my homestead was not an accident. It was arson, committed to destroy the original deed that would prove it. It was arson, and it was murder. He laid the old survey map on the judge's bench. I ask this court to not only dismiss Mr. Rook's petition, but to open a full investigation into the business dealings and the criminal activities of Judge Bartholomew Rook. The courtroom was in chaos. Judge Rook, his face purple with rage, was demanding Wade's arrest for slander, but Judge Whittam was staring at the map, his face grim. He impounded the map as evidence, and looking directly at Bartholomew Rook, he made his ruling. The petition is dismissed. The marriage of Wade and Eliza Carter is valid. Custody of their child will remain with them. The gavel fell. and this court will open a formal inquiry into the matters raised by Mr. Carter. Court is adjourned. They had won. But as Wade helped a trembling but triumphant Eliza out of the courthouse, he saw the look on Bartholomew Rook's face. It was not the look of a defeated man. It was the look of a cornered predator, a man with nothing left to lose. The law had failed him. Wade knew with a chilling certainty that the Rook's next move would not be in a courtroom. The first snow of winter was falling when Eliza went into labor. The storm blew in fast and furious, cutting them off from the world. It was just the three of them in May's sturdy cabin. Wade, May, and Eliza, locked in the timeless, terrifying battle of birth. The labor was long and hard. Wade held Eliza's hand, feeding her sips of water, murmuring encouragement, feeling utterly helpless as he watched the woman he had come to love writhe in a pain he could do nothing to ease. "I can't," she gasped, her body drenched in sweat. "You can and you will," May said, her voice a firm, comforting anchor in the storm of pain. "Your body knows the way. Now you push!" And then, with a final, desperate cry from Eliza, another cry answered it, thin and furious and utterly miraculous. "It's a boy," May announced, her voice thick with emotion as she lifted the squalling, red-faced infant. "And he's got a good set of lungs on him." May laid the baby on Eliza's chest, and the world seemed to stop. Wade looked at his wife, her face luminous with exhaustion and joy, and at the tiny, perfect child nestled against her, and something inside him broke open. All the grief, all the anger, all the hardness he had carried since the fire, it all just washed away. "Hello, little one," Eliza whispered, tears streaming down her face. Wade reached out a calloused finger and gently stroked the baby's soft cheek. The infant turned toward his touch, his tiny mouth working. He was real. He was here. He was safe. They named him Jonah. That night, Wade stood watch by the fire while his new family slept. The storm had passed, leaving the world silent and white and clean. He looked at Eliza and at the tiny bundle in the cradle beside her bed, and felt a love so fierce and protective it was a physical ache in his chest. He went to the window and looked out at the pristine, moonlit snow, and his heart stopped. There in the fresh snow were boot prints, a single set. They circled the house, pausing beneath each window. Someone had been out there during the storm, during the birth, watching, waiting. The Rooks hadn't given up. They were just biding their time. The final confrontation came a week later. Judge Whittam had sent word. Federal marshals were on their way to Red Mesa to arrest Judge Rook. Knowing his time was up, Rook made his last, desperate move. He and Calvin, along with a handful of hired guns, ambushed Wade's wagon on the road to perdition. They weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to take the baby. But Wade wasn't alone. When the Rook's men burst from the trees, another rifle shot answered from the rocks above the road. And another. Silas Fletcher was there. Old Man Morrison. Two other ranchers whose land bordered Rooks. Men who had suffered under his thumb for years. Nora Bell had sent word. The community, the one Wade and Eliza had slowly, cautiously become a part of, had come to stand with them. The fight was short and brutal. In the end, it was just Wade and a disarmed, defeated Calvin Rook standing in the snowy road, with baby Jonah crying in Eliza's arms in the wagon. "It's over, Calvin," Wade said. "He made me," Calvin whispered, his face a mask of misery. He looked past Wade, at his father being held at gunpoint by the ranchers. "He's not even my real father. He adopted me from an orphanage, told me he'd give me a name and a future, but only if I was worthy, my entire life. I was just trying to be worthy." Just then, the federal marshals arrived, their horses steaming in the cold air. They took Judge Bartholomew Rook into custody, his reign of terror finally at an end. They looked at Calvin, a broken man with no power and no name. "What about him?" one of the marshals asked Wade. Wade looked at Eliza. She gave a slight shake of her head. "Let him go," Wade said. "His punishment is having to live with himself." They watched as Calvin Rook, the man who was no one, turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods. Spring came to Raven's Draw, and with it, a sense of peace they had never known. With the Rook land claims invalidated, their title was clear. The community, their friends, helped them rebuild. The cabin grew, a new room added for Jonah, a proper porch where they could sit and watch the sunset. The land began to heal, and so did they. Eliza found her calling, working alongside May, delivering babies and tending to the sick throughout the territory. She was no longer the shamed woman who had run from Red Mesa. She was a healer, a respected and beloved member of the community. One evening, as they stood by the creek watching a one-year-old Jonah chase butterflies, Wade asked the question that had been sitting in his heart for a year. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About answering my advertisement? Taking a chance on a broken-down soldier with nothing but $1 and a pile of ashes?" Eliza smiled, the easy, beautiful smile he had come to love more than life itself. She took his hand. "That dollar bought me my freedom, Wade. That pile of ashes gave us a foundation to build on. And that soldier," she stood on her toes and kissed him. "That soldier became the father my son deserved and the husband I never knew I was looking for." Later that night, after Jonah was asleep, Wade sat on the porch, turning the old Morgan dollar over in his hands. It was worn and smooth, but he could still make out the eagle on one side and the face of liberty on the other. He thought about the day he'd stood outside the chapel, a man with nothing. He gambled his last dollar on a stranger. Eliza came out and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered. "This coin," he said, closing his hand around it. "I thought I was buying a wife, but I was wrong." He looked at her, his heart so full he could barely speak. "I was buying a miracle." He had started with nothing but a silver dollar and a broken heart. And somehow, in the middle of nowhere, in the ruins of his old life, he had found everything that mattered. A home, a son, a family, a love worth fighting for, and a peace that was more valuable than all the silver in the world. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It's a powerful reminder that even when you think you've hit rock bottom, there's always a chance for a new beginning. I'd love to know what you think. What was the biggest twist for you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got a lot more stories of survival, justice, and unexpected love coming your way. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.